Okay, well, thanks very much everyone for joining. And so, as I said, Simon Stevenson with NSF and Carolyn Abihi are with ICC are co-leads with me with this group. So I hope that they'll feel free to chime in or help direct the conversation today. And what we want to do today is talk about one of the performance elements that's been assigned to the Coastal Resilience Collaboration Team. If you go to the IARPC website, you can see all the performance elements, sort of the goals and objectives that are listed for this collaboration team. And one of those is being led by USGS, and that's the one that we're going to talk about today, which is sort of understanding the response of wildlife and their habitats to the rapid physical changes that are taking place in the Arctic, specifically in Alaska, as far as the projects we're going to talk about today. And so we have myself and two of our research scientists here at the Alaska Science Center lined up to speak with you today, just to sort of give you a general overview of some of the studies and some of the models that we've developed to sort of help our thinking and our research framework on this topic of wildlife and habitat response to change in the Arctic. So Meredith, if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could load up the presentation. I've put all the presentation slides into one file that's available on the ARPIC website for download if folks want to have a copy to look at. But Meredith is just going to click through these, and I can start at the beginning with sort of an introduction for this talk, and then it'll go through a section of slides that Chad will talk about and also a section that Todd will talk about. So Meredith, that looks like the last slide. I don't know if we can go up to the first one. Great, thank you. So if you can just go to the next slide, what I first thought I would talk about is just is sort of what is USGS. I've been doing this a lot lately with talks just so people are familiar with our agency and what we do and why we work on things related to biology and ecosystems when our name is the U.S. Geological Survey. First of all, the USGS is the science research agency for the Department of the Interior. And the Department of the Interior, or the DOI, is the same agency or the same group that contains the National Park Service, for example, the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and also the USGS, also Bureau of Indian Affairs, and Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management. So what we are is the science research agency that provides scientific information to those management agencies for their decision making. So we're not an agency that makes management decisions. We're not a regulatory agency. Our sole purpose is to provide sound and impartial science information for those other DOI agencies and for the public for their decision making. So that's how we structure our work. And we tend to focus on trust responsibilities, things the Department of the Interior has management authority for. So things like polar bears and migratory birds and lands that agencies such as the Bureau of Land Management oversee and manage. So next slide, Meredith. And as a result of this sort of mission, USGS plays a large role in Alaska because there are a lot of federal lands and resources in the state. So there's a lot of different migratory bird species that Fish and Wildlife Service has management responsibility for example, marine mammals such as polar bear, walrus, and sea otter that Fish and Wildlife Service and BOEM are interested in. And then, as I mentioned, land resources that BLM, Park Service, also Fish and Wildlife Service have management authority over, and so they need information about those lands. As to why the question about biology in USGS, there was a reorganization of the Department of Interior back in the mid-90s, and several hundreds of biologists in Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies were pulled into the USGS to move those research scientists out of the management agencies so that the science that the Department of Interior provides is impartial and is not necessarily housed within the same organizations where the management decisions are being made. So that's how we came to be doing biology work within USGS. So next slide. So as I mentioned, the sort of topic we're going to have conversations about today is one of the goals that's listed for the Coastal Resilience Collaboration Team. Under the performance element, advancing knowledge of ecosystems and environmental health in coastal areas, there's a specific task that USGS has a lead for, and that's worded as underneath that task bullet there, continue to develop a general Arctic-wide wildlife response model that relates to species-specific models of Arctic coastal organisms. And so if you go to the next slide, I can tell you a bit more about what this means. In 2015, the USGS published a paper in Bioscience that showed this figure, which is sort of what we call our general Arctic model of physical drivers there at the bottom, and how those are potentially changing or are changing due to human activities, and then the influence of those physical drivers up through the systems, ecosystems in the Arctic. So how those changes in temperature and moisture drive changes in sea ice cover or lake ice cover, snow and permafrost extent and thaw. Also how those influence biogeochemical fluxes in permafrost and lakes and snow, and then up into secondary effects in terms of things related to habitat or forage for wildlife, and then finally up to the focal species responses, which I mentioned before are those trust species, things like polar bears and migratory birds and walrus. And then off to that right-hand side, you can sort of see where we see places where there are new interactions among species taking place and additional human activities that may have some bearing on these different levels. So this is sort of what we came up with after the beginning of a research program that started here in 2010 called the USGS Changing Arctic Ecosystems. And in this 2015 publication, we really summarize our research effort and our framework based on this model. And so that's where this performance element for our group came about. So what I want to talk to you today is sort of how we're using this to frame our thinking about our Arctic research program. And then Todd and Chad will give some real specifics about some very detailed models that they've come up with for those species that are actually producing forecasts of what we think is going to be the sort of population status of those species into the future, given what we know is happening today and what we think is going to happen into the future with some of these physical drivers and then other effects going up. So next slide, please, Meredith. And if anyone has any questions during the presentation, feel free to interrupt. We will have time for questions at the end too, I hope, but if you're not hearing me well or if you want me to explain something, please let us know. So just to kind of walk through this a bit more, to give you some example of some of the research that we're doing before we talk about polar bears and walrus. At the bottom of the slide, or the picture there, we talk about physical drivers. So, changes in temperature and moisture, what does that mean? So if you go to the next slide, it just shows some of the examples of USGS research that we have done on the North Slope that are currently being written up. So one of the questions we had is just how does temperature influence the quality and the quantity of the vegetation that migratory birds use up on the North Slope, that caribou use, and sort of what are the temperature effects on not just the chemical properties of the wetlands, but what does that mean for forage that shorebirds rely on or that migratory geese rely on. So we've done things like put green and shade houses out in different parts of the North Slope. If we can warm the vegetation by 2 degrees or cool it by 2 degrees, what sort of change do we see in biomass, productivity, and the nutrition of those forages that geese rely on and that caribou rely on. Similar, we've done some small-scale pond warming experiments to look at invertebrate production and what that might mean for changes in fish abundance and distribution on the North Slope, and also for shorebirds as well. So those are all studies that are complete now, and we're in the process of getting those written up. Some of those should be available very soon. Next slide. Moving up this diagram here in terms of talking about secondary effects, sort of availability of food and the quality and the quantity of that food. We've done a lot of research on this topic for both migratory birds and caribou, and Todd and Chad will also talk about this a little bit, I think, in terms of polar bear and walrus. So if you go to the next slide, Meredith, there's an example here of some of the research along these lines. This figure is a slide from a Fish and Wildlife Service report where they do annual aerial surveys of the North Slope for all water birds. And so this is a report that shows the annual trend of one bird, the greater white-fronted goose, which is the fastest growing population or fastest growing species of waterfowl on the North Slope right now. So the numbers are rapidly increasing. And we think that it's really been driven by a change in an increase in the high quality food that the geese really like to eat. due to declines in sea ice. So that lower right image of the flooded tundra is actually saltwater killed tundra from declines in sea ice and then inundation by saltwater that then converts this habitat to a type that geese really like to forage on. And so some of the work we're doing with greater white-fronted geese and snow geese and black-brown on our slope is really tightly linked to these changes in the habitat that's causing the numbers of these birds to increase. So they're really taking advantage of this new forage there. So that's some work that's been published and some other work that will be coming out in the next year or two. Next slide. And then lastly, that top part of that figure, one of the things we're really striving for in this Arctic initiative that USGS has is to forecast all of these changes that we're observing on the ground into the future and to be able to provide that to coastal communities and the Department of Interior management agencies so they can understand what's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years versus the next 50 to 100 years. And this is really where the two specific models that Todd and Chad are going to talk about next have been able to move us into to really come up with predictions. And there's certainly a lot of uncertainty, and they'll talk about that, but predictions about the future status of polar bears and the walrus in the Arctic. So with that, I'll turn the next part of the presentation over to Chad to talk about walrus.
Hi, good morning. I'm the Chad J, and I'm the program lead for Pacific Walrus here at Alaska Science Center. Next slide, please. Just over 5 years ago, we developed this Bayesian belief network model that was an effort to kind of bring together the different environmental and human influences that may impact the outcome of walruses with the changing ecosystem that we're experiencing up here. And I'm not going to go into any real detail here. It's just to show that it was a way to link various factors together and to try to quantify those and document what we know and what we don't know about these different interactions and how that comes down to affect the future outcome of walruses in some kind of quantitative way. Up at the top there, you see I've circled a few boxes up there. Those yellow boxes at the top are essentially input to the model. There's actually 3 sub-models to this. I'm just showing you the summer-fall sub-model. And you see to the right, there's a few boxes that pertain to sea ice habitat in the Chukchi and the Bering Sea and ice-free months, the duration of ice-free months. A box there that relates to food and how prey may change in the future, and also ocean acidification and its effects. A lot of this we don't have a lot of information on. Harvest, which has more of a direct impact on total mortality of walruses. And then I've circled traffic, ship and air traffic, and how that might influence disturbance at haulouts and potential oil spills that can have direct mortality or affect the condition of walruses. And then those things come down to the bottom there to give some indication of what we would expect as future outcome in terms of robust, persistent, vulnerable, rare, or extirpated population. So we developed this, it was published in 2011, and it was helpful to really think about how these things come together, how they may be interacting, and also to think about how to focus our research as well, where our next step should be. Next slide, please. So since then, we've been spending more time in what you see circled there, and that's looking at how sea ice and changes in sea ice and the forecast in sea ice into the future affects the available ice for walruses as far as habitat, which can affect crowding and mortality that way, but also can affect energy expenditures then ultimately body condition and the demographics of walruses. So that's been kind of our focus over the last number of years since we finished this model in 2011. Next slide. So one of the more obvious things that we've seen since then, and even during the time that we were developing that model, are these coastal haulouts that have formed in response to the lack of sea ice over the continental shelf. The ice has been receding far north of the shelf where walruses can't forage effectively. And so when that happens, the time that ice runs out, the animals come to shore and start forming these large haulouts in the tens of thousands, both northwest Alaska and at various haulouts in the northern part of Chukotka in Russia, all of the same population. And that has a couple implications, at least, and one is just that when there are this large number and density of animals, that if there's a disturbance and animals start to stampede into the water, then they trample young, and there's mortality of young that occurs from disturbances on shore. And another implication is that without that sea ice over the continental shelf, they're not able to forage in some of the same areas that they previously did. In northeast Alaska, or the northeastern Chukchi Sea, I think most know that the Hannah Shoal is a favored foraging area. It's very productive, and walruses can stay in that area. In the past, they were able to stay in those very profitable foraging areas and haul out on sea ice. But without that sea ice now, they have to come to shore. And there's some animals now that are, a lot of those animals are feeding near shore. And then there's other animals too that are leaving the haul out and traveling much greater distances to forage in Hannah Shoal and then return to the haul out near Point Lay here in Alaska. And so those things have energetic consequences, and that was part of our focus in some of the work that we've completed and that we're still pursuing. Next slide. One of the things that we're just now, well, not just now, but that we're following up on over the last few years, now that animals are in large numbers hauling out on the coast. And the important thing here too is that these animals are mixed herds of adult females, males, and young. And this is something that just hasn't really occurred much in the recent history, but has occurred now, these large haulouts, 9 out of the last 11 years during the summertime. So getting an idea of how many animals are affected, how many animals are coming to shore, and possibly even taking advantage of those large aggregations to survey the population for age and sex structure for population models. We have done some fixed wing surveys over the large haul out that occurs at Point Lay in collaboration with the community of Point Lay. And where we'd like to move is because those fixed wings aircraft, there's a chance of disturbances as they fly over to take photographs. And also they can't repeat those surveys as often because of weather and other constraints, is to do some of these surveys now with drones, these UASs. And so we're working right now with Russian colleagues in Chukotka to look at the use of these drones for surveying these large haulouts in both Russia and Alaska. And this year, right now, in fact, there are Russian scientists at 6 different haulout sites on the coast of Chukotka with these drones. and they're taking photos, and we're going to see what we can do to use those to quantify the number of animals hauling out, and like I mentioned before, perhaps even at some point be able to survey them for sex and age composition. Next slide. The other large part of the information that we get and the data that we use for the studies that we're doing is through this satellite telemetry, where we apply these tags to walruses remotely with crossbows. We've been doing this since about 2007. We've developed these tags, and it's allowed us to put out a lot of tags in a lot of different areas, which is needed to make population level inferences. And the only thing I'll mention here really about these tags is not only on that diagram on the right, not only are we able to get tracking information, but we're able to get information on the activity of the walrus, whether they're hauled out or not, and if they're in water, whether they're foraging or not. And this is just an example of one animal that was tagged in 2010 in northeast Chukchi, and the track of that animal over into Russia, over in the western Chukchi, just north of Wrangel Island. And where you see the red are places where that animal was foraging, blue where the animal was in the water not foraging, and white when the animal was hauled out on ice. Next slide. So what that looks like is the framework that we've been following and working on is starting at the top there, the environment. This is similar to what John was talking about, is that we have the environment, and that environment includes both the physical environment, but also what humans are doing. And then how does that affect walrus activity budgets in terms of the time that they spend resting in the water, swimming and foraging. And that information is what we get from those radio tags. That information then is fed to a bioenergetics model, a couple models that have been developed together with our biometrics program here and others. And that in that bioenergetics model, that the left side of that equation there is energy and expenditure. And the only thing I want to point out here really is that that energy expenditure is dependent on basal metabolism, growth, molt, reproduction, and activity. And that activity is what we're talking about when we see the walrus activity budgets that lead into that. So that allows us to provide a direct link into the bioenergetics and what is required by the animal to maintain growth and reproductive status. Then that information, that data then flows into demographic modeling to look at reproduction and survival that might be expected from those animals. So that's the overall framework that we've been working in, and we've worked through the activity budget published on these different boxes here, and primarily looking at the influence of sea ice and how it works through these boxes down to demographics of the population. But this overall framework, though, now also allows us to look at things like vessel traffic and other things, and how that comes into the model and ultimately affects the walrus activity budgets and so forth down into that chain. Next slide. So another study effort that we just got underway now is trying to look at the potential impact of ship traffic on walrus activity and bioenergetics and so forth down that chain I just talked about. And this is just an example. We've just got started really, and this is a slide of vessel tracks from AIS data for 2015, and that's in green. The red lines there are walrus tracked from 38 tagged walruses in 2015, and then those yellow X's there are places where there is a potential for interaction between a vessel and a tagged walrus. And that's just based right now, just for this example, if the walrus was within 5 kilometers in an hour of that vessel, then it got marked as a potential interaction. So we're putting these 2 data sets together now, and we'll go through a modeling exercise to estimate the activity level based on the occurrence of ship traffic in the Chukchi Sea. And I think that's it. Next slide. Yeah, so that's all I have. It's really just to kind of show. I don't really have time to go into any of the specific studies that have been done and so forth, but to give a kind of an overall view of the framework that we're using to look at some of the issues that walruses are faced with. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Chad. Unless anyone has any questions specific on walrus, we can just go to the next slide, and Todd Atwood can talk about the framework they're using.
Hang on one second.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
This is Nicole, Laura, and Casey in Fairbanks. So Chad, are you gonna talk a little bit about, kind of the news we got this morning and what you think that means for the future?
Well, I can't really say anything more than what Fish and Wildlife Service has released. That's a decision that's all in their office. So, I mean, we will continue to do what we're doing, and I think there's continued interest that we're hearing from our partners and from other stakeholders in looking at how changing sea ice and the changing environment is affecting walruses. And it's not only a change in their habitat, but also, of course, allowing for more human activities up in the Arctic. So there's still interest in how walruses might be influenced or impacted by activities up in the Arctic. So it really doesn't change kind of what we're doing and the thrust in our program, and our partners still be important.
How many ships do all those ship tracks represent in 2015?
We haven't, well, in the Chukchi Sea, we don't have that enumerated. I mean, there's a report, I think there's a Ireland et al. 2016, which is an industry report. They summarized the number of ships, and I forget what they summarized for 2015. I think it was on the order of 150 ships up there. The thing is with this AIS data too, this is it's only required for greater than 300 tonnage ships and passenger ships. So it may not include some of the smaller vessels as well. I don't have a number for what's in the Chukchi in this particular example here, but we have that data right now.
Any other questions for Chad?
Hi, this is Carolina. Can you hear me? Hi,
Yeah.
Sorry, I guess I was on mute a moment ago. Chad, thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you for the last person that asked that question and for your response, Chad. I just wanted to share with the group that in speaking with some colleagues this morning, that weren't going to be able to attend today's webinar, but were very interested, that they also raised the same questions of having a lot of curiosity of what the ship traffic was from, particularly because they noted that oil and gas activity was particularly lower during that time. And one of the reasons they were raising that question is in thinking of what additional stressors might there be for walrus, considering noise and impact and things like that. So again, I appreciate your response, but just wanted to share with the group that a few other people here in Alaska were also looking at this and kind of wondering the same thing.
Yeah, and I'll just add that as far as ship traffic goes, we're going to be looking too if we can get the data in terms for some of these latter years on industry activities and see how that may be have influenced the behavior of walruses. But also just to keep in mind that a lot of the ship traffic has to do with commerce too, and shipping goods and things. So, and in fact, in terms of total numbers, there's more vessel traffic from that than there is from industry, and that certainly added to it when they were active in the Northeast Chukchi. The other thing too to keep in mind is on this map here, if you look on the left there, those green lines, you can see basically kind of a grid like a survey in north of Wrangel Island. Rosneft, Russia, is interested in that area and an area just south of that as well for oil and gas activities. So walruses I think we need to keep in mind, when you talk about the population, to also keep thinking that this population extends over into Russian waters as well and is influenced by any activities over there. So, so anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. And also these X's that you see, this is just kind of an example. I mean, these are from tagged walruses, and only where we had tagged animals on the air when the shipping was going on. So, sorry, the traffic was happening during 2015. So it's of course not it's a bit of a biased look at where those interactions might be occurring because it's dependent on where we have tagged animals on the air.
Thank you, Chad.
Do you know what that wad of ship tracks is off of Icy Cape?
Do I know what that is?
I mean, that's not oil exploration, not in 2015 anyway. Do we know why all those ships were out there?
Well, 2015 there was activity. There was oil and gas activity out there.
Okay.
And there was also I'm not sure in terms of some of their other environmental surveys too. I'm just guessing it could be something there around the Berger area and things, but I don't really have those specifics. This is something that we'll be looking at this in more detail. We're just really now compiling. We have to purchase a lot of this data and compiling that data. So I can't give much in terms of specifics right now.
Okay.
So Chad, it's Carolina. Would it be okay if I ask another quick question?
Sure.
I apologize if I missed this. Just out of curiosity, do you guys have a general practice of kind of, I guess for the lack of a better term, ground truthing some of this information with the indigenous knowledge holders that are living within the area?
Well, I guess, what do you mean by ground truthing?
I think I probably chose the wrong term. Maybe taking a look at some of the data in like maps like this and saying, well, this is what aerial surveys showed. Does this correlate with what you're seeing and what you know, and what supplemental information they may be able to provide through that type of conversation?
Yes. Yeah. We periodically, especially with some active studies, meet with Point Lay, Wainwright, Barrow at times, Point Hope, and Savunga, other villages that are interested to share the information and also to see how that corresponds or what's being seen locally in those areas as well. So we'll certainly be doing the similar thing with this study.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's if folks don't mind, let's move on to Todd's presentation so we don't run out of time, and then we can still have some questions at the end.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name's Todd Atwood. I'm the leader of the USGS Polar Bear Research Program. And thank you, Meredith, for forwarding through the slides here. So I'm going to dive right in, and unfortunately, I don't have the level of detail that Chad had, so I apologize for that, but I'll try and fill in some gaps here where I think I can in terms of our model structure and our main findings. So for polar bears, the main conservation need is similar to what Chad expressed for walruses. It's integrated science. So it's science that links changes in the sea ice ecosystem driven by large-scale anthropogenic activities like greenhouse gas emissions to likely polar bear population responses or population outcomes. Excuse me. And that sounds, I guess, pretty straightforward, but I'm sure everybody on the line realizes that it's not as easy as it sounds. You know, the main impediment or the main challenge is that you have to identify relationships between environmental change and the influence of existing and emergent or soon to emerge population stressors. And for polar bears, at least, that's kind of a multi-step process. First, you have to identify likely population stressors like habitat loss, changes in the health and availability of prey species, and types and intensities of human activities, and particularly human activities that are likely to become more prevalent over time. Then you have to be able to link those stressors to population vital rates, which is a really data-hungry process. It requires a lot of information on a lot of different little pieces. And then if you're going to forecast, you need to understand the relationships between physical drivers like greenhouse gas emissions and ecosystem responses. And so when you take all that together, it can be pretty difficult to try and bring all that information and link all those moving parts together and do that in a kind of a unified analytical framework that you can use for forecasting. That said, I think that Bayesian network models are an organizational and analytical tool that are well suited for that. And at least in the case of polar bears, are well suited for forecasting population responses to suites of stressors, which is basically how we use our Bayesian network model. And the idea is that we can run these projections, these forecasts, which can then be used by managers to make informed and hopefully proactive decisions about how they want to address likely population stressors before they become an issue for the population. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on over the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So again, the key need that we have for polar bears is to have some kind of analytical framework that incorporates the complexity of their sea ice ecosystem, and that also allows us to generate probability-based results of population outcomes. And the Bayesian network framework's a pretty straightforward, I guess, is maybe not the best term, but a pretty accommodating framework for doing that. Network models allow us to integrate different types and forms of data, which is really important when you're trying to deal with large and complex systems. And so, for example, we can bring together simulated data like sea ice projections derived from general circulation models. We can bring in observational data describing relationships between sea ice habitat and polar bear vital rates. And we can also bring in information in the form of expert knowledge. And one of the, I guess, probably less heralded aspects of Bayesian network models is that in instances where data or knowledge for certain stressors are lacking, we can represent that uncertainty explicitly in the model. And then the idea being that you explicitly represent uncertainty in the model, then you devote resources and effort to trying to fill those knowledge gaps. Once you have new information available, you can circle back to your model and revise it to incorporate that new information. And through that iterative process, you're hopefully over time reducing uncertainties associated with your projections. Next slide, please. So that iterative process is the process that we're engaged in with our Bayesian network model. The first generation model was developed probably about 10 years ago now. It was developed by Steve Amstrup, who was leading the program then, and Bruce Marcoux. Bruce is with the Forest Service, and he's an expert on decision-making modeling, and particularly an expert on the development and application of Bayesian network models. So that first generation model was used to project regional population outcomes as a function of two greenhouse gas emission scenarios, so a business as usual scenario and then a mitigated scenario. And in that initial effort, Steve and Bruce were really just focused on identifying when extinction was the most probable outcome for a given regional population. So they were projecting population outcomes through the end of the century. So similar to what Chad showed with his model, they're looking at these effects of different greenhouse gas emission scenarios on things like sea ice metrics, how that's influencing the distribution and availability of marine prey, how that's influencing polar bear behavior. Are we seeing more bears now come to shore like we're seeing with walruses? And the short answer to that is yes, we are. And that feeds information into kind of a demographic submodel, which looks at how those changes to the physical system impact vital rates like body condition, survival, and ultimately the response variable to all this is some type of population outcome. And they're projecting this through different points throughout the century. So with the second generation model was updated about 1.5 years ago. And basically, with that model, we were taking a different approach. We wanted to identify which stressors had the greatest influence on future population outcomes. So we weren't necessarily, we were projecting outcomes, but we were less interested in the actual outcomes and more interested in the relative importance of individual stressors. And then, and I think that'll become apparent in a second, the other aspect of that revised effort was to determine whether the strength of those stressors was amplified or lessened relative to different future climate trajectories. And here we depicted those different trajectories using different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So we included a very aggressive mitigation scenario, a modest mitigation scenario, and then a business as usual scenario where there's basically no mitigation. With the second generation model, the last thing we did was conduct what are called influence analyses, and this is a pretty common aspect of evaluating the performance of Bayesian network models. And it's really useful for identifying the relative importance of individual stressors in models. So that allowed us to kind of game different management scenarios where we could project potential future outcomes as a function of where we chose to devote resources regarding management effort. If we wanted to focus on a handful of stressors, what kind of payoff would we get from that effort? If we wanted to focus on just a couple of key individual stressors, but kind of go all in on those stressors, what kind of payoff would we get in terms of population outcomes? So for the revision, we started with the first generation model, kind of reworked that using information that had become available since that model was developed in 2007. And in the process of revising the first generation model, we added more specificity. And one of the more important things we did was take those stressors, which in the first generation model were grouped in kind of stressor families, and we broke those down into individual specific stressors so we could do this influence analysis that I was just mentioning. And then, of course, we project the outcomes as a result of competing management decisions. Next slide, please. So again, looking at Chad's presentation, I realized I should have included some results for you in a slide, but I didn't. I'll cut to the chase. What we found was that by far the most influential driver of future population outcomes are changes in sea ice habitat. But you can devote resources and effort to managing other primarily anthropogenic local stressors and buy you a little bit of time until you can, say, implement a process where you begin to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not that the only thing you can do to ensure the long-term persistence of polar bears is mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. That's a key. But you also can kind of recover the population from a better point if you focus on some kind of source point management issues. In terms of how the information from our Bayesian network models are being used or have been used, the first generation model was one of the science products used to inform the 2008 listing decision. The second generation model was used to inform the development of a section of the Polar Bear Conservation Management Plan, which came out either the beginning of this year or late last year. So for the Conservation Management Plan, we use the Bayesian network model to inform the threats assessment portion, where we identify the most pressing threats to recovery and then use that information to develop recovery-based criteria that can be used to measure progress towards mitigating those threats. And Chad also mentioned this, that the models are useful just in helping you identify knowledge gaps and direct resources internally. And so within our program, that's one of the main ways that we kind of prioritize our 5-year research plan, as we look at our Bayesian network model and identify areas where right now we're characterizing certain stressors as being relatively uncertain in terms of their effects on polar bears. And we can use that to say, okay, we're going to focus on these uncertainties over the next 5 years and try and resolve those knowledge gaps, bring that information back to the model, and revise it for the next generation of forecasts. And so one of the needs that we're seeing in terms of information gaps relates to polar bear health. Whether we're seeing adverse impacts to the health of individuals, there's some reason to believe that we are seeing that, at least in the southern Beaufort. And whether those adverse impacts to individual health scale up to population level impacts. And then, of course, we're interested in having a better understanding of local anthropogenic effects, particularly those associated with resource extraction activities. Next slide, please. And that's basically the plan for moving forward. We've got a couple of studies in progress that address those issues, the polar bear health issue and the human-bear interaction issue. For the latter, we have a study that's evaluating drivers and consequences of interactions along the Beaufort Sea coast. And the goals with that are to identify activities that are enhancing risk of interactions, and then model risk of conflict relative to expanded development. You know, Chad mentioned the increase in haul-out behavior on land by walruses, and I kind of touched on that a second ago. We are seeing a pretty steep increase in the reliance on terrestrial habitat by polar bears in the southern Beaufort and in the Chukchi. And so the primary concern is that we have bears using space more intensively, and environmental conditions being conducive to humans using the coastal area, particularly for economic development, that we're likely to see an increase in human-bear interactions and see that escalate into conflict. That's something that should be relatively easy to manage, and so we're partnering with Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Land Management, some industry folks, and hopefully bring some other groups into this to drill down on this and address that knowledge gap in our current iteration of the Bayesian network model. And that's all I have.
Okay, well, great, Todd, and thanks also to Chad. So looks like we have a few minutes left for our hour here. So if there's any questions, let us know.
Yeah, this is Simon. So I'm just going to jump on, I think it was the second last slide that talked about potentially other partners. So it's either in either of the cases or in any of the cases, because we're more than 2 species, do you get a sense that there's another agency or another outfit, another entity that has data that you could really use already, or has the potential of getting that data, and it's difficult to get it? Because that's, focus of IOPIC is to sort of try to help make those connections. So that's a question to any of the 3 speakers.
This is Chad. Yeah, I could just comment real briefly that that for us and for this this interaction study that we're embarking on, we're starting with vessel traffic so we can get that, purchase that, and that's available, the AIS data for that. But we are also interested in looking at this, the industry, seismic surveys and things like that. So we're hoping that we can get some of that data through, some collaborations with industry. Some of that is proprietary information. So we still will be embarking on that and having some conversations, but that's a place where, yes, we don't have that data, and it'll take some coordination to try to get that data.
Yeah, Simon, I can speak for polar bears, and we've shared information quite a bit with industry, particularly regarding location of dens, so that they can, mitigate their activities during the denning period. We do get some industry data via mandated reporting requirements. It'd be nice to get data from more than just the usual players. So there's some folks that are really good about providing data, and some other folks that are harder to reach. The other area that's sometimes a challenge is getting data from coastal communities. So we're hoping that we can work through the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management to kind of help facilitate that.
Yeah, Todd, thank you for bringing that up. I was curious because I thought that, sorry, this is Carolina. I did think that you actually were already partners with North Slope Borough in particularly even across the border over to Canada in gathering information and in working with hunters. Isn't that something you already do?
We do it on a kind of a study-by-study basis. So, for example, yeah, so we're partnering with the North Slope Borough on a TEK study for the Southern Beaufort. We partnered with them, as you just mentioned, and along with the Canadian colleagues on a spring aerial survey of the Southern Beaufort, transborder aerial survey. We've talked to them about trying to get human-bear interaction, human-bear conflict data from the communities, and I think they're kind of in the same boat that we are. They see the value of those data. It's just hard to get it collected in a way that is consistent, so that you don't have to deal with like a reporting bias issue.
Thank you.
Sure.
May I ask a question? Do we have time? This is Guillermo.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Are you aware of the research that Nicole Misarti from UAF is doing on polar bears and climate change and adaptation? Because I think it will be interesting to insert. She constructed a very interesting time series of walrus adaptability and population change over time using DNA analysis. It will be interesting to contrast both studies and see how yours fits or not in her time series. I think she's online. I see Nicole online.
I am, and
Also, I wanted to mention as well that Laura's has a new proposal in to do, well, even more with polar bears. I'm going to have her talk about that really quickly.
So just to fill you in on that, this is actually together with the North Slope Bureau and also with Nicole. But we have proposed to look at polar bear bones as an indicator over the past 200 years to look at terrestrial feeding and how that may have increased and what the health consequences are of that. And we have actually reached out to Fish and Wildlife Service as well, and also to the Canadians. And we would definitely love to talk to you guys a little bit more about what you may have, in terms of materials. So, and if any of you are in Halifax, I do have a talk about some preliminary data on the Beaufort Sea population.
And our whole walrus team is going to be in Halifax as well, with all the sort of latest updates on that long-term data that Guillermo was talking about. But yeah, we're partnered. We've been working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and, ADF&G, and a lot of those villages have been helping us out as well, not just with getting us samples, but, we've been in the villages and they've been quite helpful, so.
Well, it sounds like interesting work. This is Todd again. Our program typically doesn't come across harvested samples, and so I don't think we'd be able to help you with bone samples, but Fish and Wildlife Service would be a good point of contact.
Yeah, we're not necessarily looking for harvested samples just either. So as I said, it's over 200 years. And I think there are some USIC, collections that are around probably in some, garages and whatnot. So if anyone has any info on that, that would absolutely be amazing.
Okay, well, I think unfortunately we're out of time, but if anyone has any additional questions for Todd or Chad or myself, feel free to send us an email at the Alaska Science Center. There's also a comment box on the IARPC website under the collaborations team agenda for this meeting, and you're welcome to post comments there or also upload information about programs you're working on to share with other folks. So that's another spot. So we really appreciate everyone's participation today, and we will be having another call in another month